Hi, my name is Chenyao. I'm from Indiana. I'm a part of obviously Fridays for Future Digital, but also in Indiana locally, a statewide student-led organization called Confront the Climate Crisis, where we're trying to get our state government to declare climate emergency. I'm in central Indiana, so near Indianapolis, near the capital.
How has climate change affected you and changed your daily life?
Yeah, I feel like climate change has affected me in a lot of ways, but a lot of the things that have happened you don't really notice until it's too late, which isn't good. I feel like for me personally, the largest effect that I see is the heat waves, like the global warming part of climate change. I'm a runner, so I go out a lot, especially in the summer. And in like especially last year and this year, there's been a lot more of like those heat waves and especially just like days where we actually have heat advisory warnings. So it's like if you're a young child, if you're elderly, you shouldn't go outside because it's going to get up to like 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is pretty warm for us. We're not actually that far south. There's more storms, but at the same time in the summer it's getting drier. So less storms, but more storms. I don't know if that makes sense. When I run a lot, especially on trails, it's dustier, it's harder sometimes because there's more like just particulates in the air. As I mentioned, I'm in central Indiana. It's pretty close to Indianapolis. So this is obviously the human-made part. We have a lot of factories there. One of our major things is the industry, and they all run off of like coal and fossil fuels, which is bad. So Indianapolis has experienced a lot of air pollution, especially this summer, and adding that with the heat waves, it's just a very bad mixture. I feel like also going into the part about more storms, Indiana apparently has been added into like the tornado alley like kind of label, which is I mean, I was kind of satisfied when I heard that because we get a lot of tornadoes, but it's also kind of terrible because we get a lot of tornadoes. We've been getting more storms, more lightning storms, which doesn't personally affect me, but it affects a lot of farmers. And I I live in the suburbs, so I see the city, but I also see like the rural, the farms, the many cornfields that make up Indiana. I feel like I feel like the biggest effects that we see is like the weather patterns. Yeah, the tornadoes are kind of terrible. The storms. I know I did a small project on that just for a science class, and there actually have been increasing storms in Indiana and storms that have increased in intensity. So where we might just get like a few rain showers, we've been getting more thunderstorms, more lightning, and more storms that have the chance, like the possibility of becoming tornadoes.
Has climate change in a way personally affected yourself, or like how it has like where your daily life that you once knew is now changed in some form, for the better or for the worst?
I feel like negatively it hasn't really affected me that much. I'm lucky to live in like, the suburbs, a relatively like sheltered place, but I feel like it actually has positively affected me because, I've learned a lot more about environmental science, a lot more about why global warming really does affect the earth and why it will really affect Indiana. I've met a lot of people, as I've mentioned, in the Confront the Climate Crisis, and I feel like it has personally affected me because I've gotten a lot more involved in advocating for like more environmental and climate protection, in advocating for, better regulations in our factories that when we're talking about clean water, clean air, which our state government has actually been repealing instead of adding on to. It's like in Bloomington, it's like a relatively decent city. There's like a college there, IU. There's a water reservoir called the Lake Monroe Reservoir, and it provides drinking water to like 100,000 people, like a lot of people, a giant city. Okay, maybe not giant in terms of New York, giant in terms of Indiana. Um, but right now, like the U.S. Forest Service, they're there saying that they want to be like logging thousands of acres of trees, which is going to lead to like erosion, which a lot of like Indiana environmentalists And people that I've actually had the opportunity to meet have said this is going to lead to erosion, this is going to harm the reservoir, this is going to contaminate the drinking water there. And because our Indiana Department of like environmental management that checks this stuff has already said that because of like algae, because of the erosion that's already happened there, that the drinking water in that reservoir is technically already contaminated. But because as I mentioned, a lot of like the Clean Water Acts are being repealed, not just in Indiana, but also in like the US. Um, there hasn't really been anything done about that. So I've had like the opportunity to meet a lot of these scientists, to meet people who are going to like sue the US Forest Service, people who are going to advocate for this. So it has personally affected me in many ways. I feel like a lot of them are positive. Obviously, climate change is not positive, but in the ways it has affected me, it has helped me become like just a more confident person too, since I've tried to get more in contact with my state legislatures, calling them. Even I have a meeting actually scheduled with one next month where we're going to talk about, just being like, hey, we're your constituents and we'd really appreciate it if you supported some of this climate legislature, this environmental regulations.
So could you tell me more about your climate activism that you've done?
Yeah, so I was in middle school at the time. I kind of heard about, Greta Thunberg, the whole movement that was going on with Fridays for Future, and then last year, 2019, on the like Global Day of Climate Action on September 20th, I decided to skip school and go to a protest in downtown Indiana in front of our state house, and it was it was awesome. Honestly, there were so many people there. There was actually like news, I guess, how do I say this? There was like a journalist there actually covering what we were doing. And I went there with some of my friends and we made signs and we talked a lot in front of the state house. But I met just people that were older than me, but also not so old that, they felt like there was this huge disconnect there. And then I felt like that really encouraged me to dive deeper into climate activism and environmental activism and see really what was happening in Indiana. A lot of what we talked about on that day was clean air protection because, as I mentioned, in downtown Indianapolis, there are so many factories there, and it really is like an urban city. So air pollution there is really like the greatest danger. I know even in where I am, which is like the suburbs, there have been more days, especially in the summer, where if you go and like check the air quality index, there'll actually be like a warning, like for unhealthy, for like sensitive groups, which obviously isn't like a teenager, but still, the fact that the warning is there is kind of surprising because there weren't like warnings like that. There wasn't actually the air quality index on the weather app, at least for Indiana, until like a few years ago, and it got added in because there has actually been increasing air pollution there, and we actually have started to get these warnings. In climate activism, as I mentioned, I joined Fridays for Future this year, but even before that, I was trying to do more in Indiana, and especially in my city. We have like a school club, which is like the Green Action Club, and well, at first, I was kind of like skeptical, I guess, about how much we could do since we were all high schoolers. But we actually managed to get a lot done, especially since I think I'm lucky to live in a city where our mayor actually really supports going greener and going like cleaner. We managed to work a lot with our administration and we got like a composting initiative started in our school lunches. We started to reduce plastic, but that actually changed this year because there needs to be more packaging this year in terms of COVID. But we plan on like when we can kind of return relatively to normal, want to try and go back to like reducing how much plastic that we use in like our school food. This year we've been actually doing some plans to just get more and more people involved. We were talking with administration about like going on like the announcements and talking more about what's happening in the city and the state. We've talked about, doing some more like we were calling it like artivism, where we would try to like make posters and like murals in our school hallways to just involved a lot of like because Indiana, it used to be a giant forest, like before colonizers came. And really, I'm lucky that like I can in my backyard I can see like some of the remaining forest there, but a lot of Indiana's forests have been cut down, which really is a loss because we have a lot of different types of trees, a lot of different types of like animals, especially bats that only live in like this region. We've been trying to get people more involved with that. This year, as I mentioned, just like last month, is when Confront the Climate Crisis, which is the statewide organization, really like kicked into gear. Before that, there were a lot of like really small groups in Indiana that worked, like in like central Indiana. There was like the Socialist for Public Liberation that worked a lot for climate activism. There were people in like West Lafayette, but this year we've really managed to unite over Zoom mainly. I feel like even though it's been a month, we've got a lot done. We have a petition that's basically asking our state government to declare a climate emergency that's gotten 7,000 signatures. We've gotten a lot of activists like Jamie Margolin. Margolin, like she is the founder of Zero Hour. She actually signed our petition, and not just like climate activists, but people in Indiana have signed the petition, have starting to get more involved in this. So this month we've started to meet with more legislators, and so not necessarily ask them. We're actually writing a resolution. It's really cool because this is a group made up of mainly high schoolers and college students, and we're actually writing like a bill that we want to try and get passed. Obviously, with help from like professional politicians, professional lawyers. We've just been starting to meet with legislators to talk to them to say like, hey, we'd really appreciate it if you started supporting more of these regulations, more of these bills, because blah 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 blah. Because climate change really is going to affect Indiana. We've started to try to get in contact with more of what people would consider like the Republican crowd that kind of like deny climate change as a thing, but especially in Indiana, because a lot of these people are like farmers living in more rural regions. They're the ones that will actually be hit the hardest by climate change in Indiana, at least, because obviously I mentioned with like earlier the storms and the heat waves, they're going to like it's predicted that they're going to cut down on crop yields by a lot, and it's a really funny stereotype that Indiana's like just cornfields, but I mean it's kind of true. And a lot of people do rely on this, and our economy also does partially rely a lot on crop yields and a lot on coal industry, which is the bad part. So we've been trying to get that passed. Um, this is something that we just did like a week ago. We not confront the climate crisis, but we shared this petition about net metering, which is basically this thing where it's like if people want to go solar, if they want to use reusable resources, they can produce their own electricity. And currently, that's gonna like phase out in the next few years, which means that if like Indiana Hoosiers, if they want to go solar, they'll no longer be able to produce their own electricity. So we're trying to like make sure that gets passed again. That way, obviously, one household going completely renewable isn't going to fix the climate crisis, but the more people that starts to realize that it's a problem and decide to start going solar, start using renewable power is a lot better. So a lot of petitions that we've been doing. We haven't really been doing any strikes this year, obviously with the coronavirus. Maybe next year when the vaccine comes out, I do want to try and go again, and this time be more involved with planning and everything.
Let's say your family, or even if you stayed in Indiana, or even just you in general, and by when you're old, even by the end of the century, how would it personally, and just generations on beyond, like how would it affect you that both good and more so on the bad, but like how would it personally affect you that could harm you in some way, or your family, or even your city in Indiana?
Yeah, so I feel like my plan isn't to stay in Indiana for the rest of my life, but I mean there obviously is still going to be people in Indiana, and even if I do like decide to stay in Indiana for the rest of my life, I feel like hopefully there will be more positives than negatives, but if we're saying right now, if we're saying maybe, knock on wood, please say this doesn't happen, but say our petitions fail and our state government doesn't do anything, we stay with the coal industry, we don't increase regulations, then I feel like, I mean, the biggest things that we will notice first, I actually don't think it's going to be like the air pollution from like our industries, because I feel like unfortunately we've gotten used to those. I feel like it's really going to be like the warming of like, the earth and the changing of like the weather patterns, because like I mentioned, kind of one, like our economy runs off of like two big things, which is like our crops and also the industry. And if the earth continues to warm, then our summers are going to get even hotter and even drier, but then our like rainy seasons is going to get even like wetter, possibly with more lightning, with more thunderstorms. And these are all like things that are going to really, really negatively impact, well, farmers. So in terms of impacting me, it'll probably be, what I'll see in the Indiana state economy. Well, our crop yields bring in like $30 billion into our economy like annually. Like it's huge, a part of our industry, because obviously it's Indiana. The stereotype is there for a reason. I feel like if I continue to live like where I am right now, I might see more flooding. I live near like the White River. Thankfully not near like the Great Lakes, but definitely more flooding from like storm seasons. By the end of the century, I really hope we will have like legislation there to protect us and to make sure that we're cutting down on this stuff, and hopefully not just Indiana but the whole world. But really, I feel like also by then the air pollution is going to get a lot worse, since we're already like the eighth worst state for like air quality, and there's 50 states. So that's not a good number right there. So I feel like especially in Indianapolis it'll get worse. I'm sure you heard the case of like the girl in South London whose death was attributed to major air pollution in that region. And nothing like that has really happened here, but there have been people, like elderly people too, who've died because of like the heat waves of heat stroke, who have died because the air is really just dangerous and they have an asthma attack, and then maybe there are other contributing factors. I feel like if by the end of the century, if we haven't really worked together to solve the climate crisis yet, these are definitely things that will be happening. I mean, obviously the economy suffering is going to be probably the concern that affects me the most, since I'm not really a farmer. I don't live in the city, but as a state, those are the biggest things we'll be seeing.
To kind of summarize this interview in a way, why do you fight for climate justice?
The main reason why I try and fight for climate justice is because I think it's because I am privileged enough that, like as I mentioned, even by the end of the century, I probably won't be that personally affected by like the changing weather patterns and stuff. I think it's because I'm privileged enough that I can like live in a house in the suburbs and, not have to worry about like farming and not have to worry about air pollution in the cities. But because there are people who do have to worry about that, and there are people who, have to worry about that a lot. And it's kind of unfair for me to like, not just unfair, but it's also kind of like hurts personally to know that like, I might be fine about this, but there's other people who are going to be really severely harmed by the climate crisis, by the rising temperatures. Also, because it's in the name itself, it's climate justice. It's something that we should really all be striving for, to reach climate justice, environmental justice. Climate justice is really a great way to say it, because when you talk about the environment when you're a kid, you talk about saving the polar bears, you talk about, pandas going extinct, and you talk about, animals a lot. And these are all like good topics to talk about. Obviously, we want to save the sea turtles, we want to make sure the Arctic stops melting, but we also have to think about the fact that saving animals and saving the biodiversity of the earth is important. There are people who will people who will die because of this. You're really fighting for justice for people, and also acknowledging that, I have this privilege where I don't have to worry about fighting for climate justice, but I should, because it's a thing that will eventually affect all of us, even if I will be less affected. I feel like we really need to portray this more as like a social issue, as even at times a race issue. Obviously, more Black, Hispanic people live in cities, and cities are where air pollution is going to hit the hardest. And a social issue, an economic issue too, like as I mentioned with crop yields in Indiana especially. it's just an issue. It's really going to affect every part of our lives, even if we want to try and deny that. Because I think we focus a lot on obviously areas that need to be focused on. The Philippines, which has been hit by like so many hurricanes this year, California, which has been like so many wildfires, and like their sky has been like red. But also just because I feel like in the Midwest, maybe this is a stereotype too. I feel like there's a lot of people that deny climate change in the Midwest, and there's a lot of people here in this region who don't think it's going to affect them, but it really will, and it really will like affect all of us. Not just, as I mentioned, not just because sea turtles are dying, not just because the temperature's going up a bit, but because of what that will lead to, that huge chain reaction it's going to harm the whole planet and harm. I feel like sometimes if we look at things too largely, people forget about themselves, but it's going to harm, say, like, my friend's dad who works as a farmer. It's going to harm him. It's going to harm, you know, someone who maybe works in the city and has asthma. It's going to harm just people, individual people.